Hello students, welcome to The Analyst, dated 26th of July 2023. Today, we'll look at 5 important articles. The first article will be regarding the Himachal Floods. Here, we look at the aspect that how it is a man-made disaster. Then we look at the Chinese belligerence towards India. Then we look at the legality of internet shutdown and whether or not we have right to internet. Then we look at 2 prelim-oriented articles. One is the instant settlement of SEBI, and we look at what is a no confidence motion. Now the handout of this particular session will be attached in the description for your perusal. Now the first article is regarding the Himachal floods. So what we have seen is that there has been incessant rains for last 2 weeks. And we have looked at the natural factors, and multiple articles, multiple researchers, they will point out that the primary reason for these flash floods, for these incessant rains is climate change. However, that will be ignorant of us to not look at the human induced factors or the anthropogenic factors for such an hazard or such a disaster. Now, what is the scale? The scale is approximately $2 billion, and we have lost more than 150 lives in Himachal Pradesh itself. Now, briefly, let's look at what was the Himachal model of development. And this model of development is pre-1990. That means pre-liberalization. So the idea was based on Dr. Parmar's model. And basically, Himachal Pradesh created in 1971. It followed the model of Dr. Parmar. And the idea was based on land reforms for equitable distribution of resources. Then working on human resources so that more and more people are skilled and more people are empowered to become a participant of economic activity. Then state intervention in terms of investments in core areas in social sectors. And mostly the economy was agrarian in nature with focus on cereals and apple orchards. Now what happened is, post-liberalization, the state was asked to generate more revenue by itself. Now more revenue meant that we had to go for tourism. What kind of tourism? We are talking about volume tourism. And whenever we are talking about tourism, we mean that people have to move. If people are moving, there has to be infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure? We are talking about 4-lane highways. We are talking about expressways. We are talking about connectivity of rail, creation of new airports, right? So infrastructure activities has to be developed. That means we are introducing what? We are introducing cement. In what? In a natural landscape, right? More and more natural landscape will be scraped off and there will be introduction of cement, concrete, etc. So what we call it concretization, right? Then looking at forest produce, looking at deforestation, going for more wood oriented industry, paper and pulp oriented industry, going for more medicine factories, pharmaceutical industries, right? Through incentives. Then going for cement production. Districts like Bilaspur, they are now cement producers. So ACC Ambuja will have their plant in Bilaspur, right? Then looking at diversion of water. Why? For drinking purposes. For drinking, for irrigation, and most importantly, hydropower. And when we are looking at hydropower, we are not referring to some very difficult projects. We are only referring to the green projects, and these are essentially called the run-off river projects. Now, I have taken this diagram from Uttarakhand, and this shows what is a run-off river project. So let's understand what happens in a run-off river. So this is the orientation of a river, okay? Now, either I will create a dam which has a reservoir, or I will go for a green project called run-off river project. In run-off river project, what happens is you are not decreasing the total quantum of water from the stream. So a tunnel will be drawn a tunnel will be created, and this tunnel will take out some water from the mainstream, and this tunnel will go maybe underground a mountain, and then let's say this is going below a mountain, right? And from here it will spill over, and this total height, this will generate what? This will generate the kinetic energy. Why? Because it is at a higher potential. So once the water falls, it will create electricity. So this is your run-off river project. Finally, the water will again join the mainstream. Now, what is the issue in such a project, which is called a green project, is that whenever I am creating these tunnels, so these tunnels are being created underground, right, beneath mountains. So what will happen to the sludge, to the broken rocks? So those broken rocks are usually dumped nearby the river itself, right? Now think about it. What happens when there is some amount of flooding? So river, rather than going in this direction, it will start inundating nearby areas. Once the river inundates the nearby areas, what will happen to this muck, to these rocks, sediments which we have kept? So the river will take away these sediments along with it. Now what happens is that these sediments will finally hit some other project, let's say a powerhouse, and it might destroy this infrastructure. So what started as a runoff river project became a reason for first a flash flood in this region, and then finally this flash flood leading to the failure of a powerhouse or a local reservoir somewhere downstream. And if such a powerhouse or reservoir, or let's say canal, if it is affected, then what will happen? This entire region might be flooded. So what happens is that once we modify the green landscape, the natural landscape, we are not able to ascertain what will be the magnitude of the disasters in the lower riparian regions. And this is essentially called cascading disasters. So one thing leading to another, then the next step leading to another step. So first, let's say a cloudburst, then a flash flood, then let's say a dam failure, then let's say the flooding of plains. So a very small localized hazard can be magnified due to such construction activities. Then we also need widened roads. So we are building, let's say, 4-lane highways to, let's say, Shimla, to Manali. Now, creation of such 4-lane expressways by, let's say, NHAI, what it does, it is basically we are cutting down mountains. So we are basically affecting the strength of these young fold mountains, the bonding of these young fold mountains. And mind you, these are sedimentary in nature. Therefore, they are naturally ecologically very sensitive. Then we are also moving to more cash oriented crops. And let's say I am growing more vegetables, then these vegetables will be perishable. They will perish after some time. So if I want to sell it to the market, let's say I am cultivating some broccoli in a region called Parvanu along Chandigarh. Okay, it's in Himachal Pradesh, nearby Chandigarh. So now I have to rush the broccoli to Chandigarh market. And so I need connectivity, I need faster connectivity, I need more movement of trucks, more movement of diesel guzzling vehicles, and thereby more emissions. And along with volume tourism, along with mass tourism, along with going into more vulnerable areas. So earlier we used to celebrate in Manali. Now we are celebrating our birthdays in Baralachala. So that is the difference. We are going towards more fragile regions, right? Now, What are the natural reasons? So, when we are looking at natural reasons, one reason is that the western disturbance system, which is coming from basically the Mediterranean region, it has merged into what is called the southwest monsoon. So southwest monsoon is responsible for rain in India during your rainy season. On the other hand, western disturbance usually comes in the winters. But due to climate change, both these events are coincidental, and because of which what we are seeing is that a changing nature of rain patterns, that is heavy rains in very small areas for a shorter span of time. And data also shows that how much rain Himachal has received, it is way beyond the average that Himachal used to receive during this point of time. So it is approximately 99 centimeter while expected was 75 centimeters only. Then IPCC AR6, the AR6 report of IPCC says that Himalayan region and Himalayan ecology will be the hardest hit due to climate change. And so the Himalayan floods, whether it is Himachal floods, whether it is incessant rains, these become very good case studies for your climate change, for your continuous changing patterns of monsoon, right? Now, let's look at some infrastructure projects that are running. So we have created these infrastructure projects along Beas, Satluj, Chandrabhaga and Parvati River. Now Parvati River is famous for a tourist destination called Kasol. Then if we are talking about Beas, we are essentially talking about Manali. So because there is more demand, now we are also moving for winter Spiti. Now if we look at the map of Himachal Pradesh, so Himachal Pradesh is divided. The northern parts of Himachal Pradesh is bifurcated by the Pir Panjal range. Pir Panjal range. Now what happens is, after the building of Atal Tunnel, the northern parts of Himachal Pradesh are also accessible. Why? Now we can go through the Atal Tunnel to regions of Spiti and Lahul. Now what happens is that once we are going to Lahul and Spiti, we are also affecting two rivers called Chandra and Bhaga. Chandra and Bhaga are tributaries of Chenab. So Chandrabhaga we are affecting, in Manali we are affecting Beas, then we are also affecting Satluj, we are also affecting Beas Kund, and we are also building vertical, we are also going for more tunneling, and we are cutting the mountains in terms of vertical cutting. So this diagram shows what kind of cutting is going on, and this is your Kinnaur in Himachal Pradesh. Now what happens is, usually when you cut mountains, let's say I want to build a road. So let's say this part of the road has been cut. So what I'll do is, we'll go for terrace farming. We'll create terraces. Why? Because let's say a debris falls from here and it goes down. So it is not able to go beyond, let's say 2 steps or 3 steps. But instead, if I'm going for cutting straight walls and creating these highways, then what happens? They will roll down directly on the road. So that is the problem. And why this happens? This is because if we are going for rapid construction of expressways, we have lesser time to build these expressways, then this kind of vertical cutting happens. Now, one other factor that is contributing to this construction is the militarization. The militarization, when we look at these regions, when we are looking at, let's say, these two regions, we must also appreciate a strategic angle. That is, let's say we have to move a military convoy to Kashmir. Then we usually take this route. We go through the Banihal tunnel and we reach, let's say, Srinagar. But now what we have done is, we can now directly go to, let's say, Manali and then to Atal tunnel, and finally we can reach Leh. So now we have created an alternative path of movement. Now, this movement must also be seen in light of Chinese belligerence. Because we have two toxic neighbors in our neighborhood. Therefore, there has been increased militarization, and with increased militarization, we also have to strengthen our border infrastructure, whether it is NHAI, whether it is BRO. Right? Now, what is the way forward? The way forward is that we must establish a commission of inquiry so that clear causes can come out, and most importantly, the anthropogenic causes. How anthropogenic causes are creating more coincidental and cascading disasters. Then we must empower the local communities. Why? Because the local communities, they have their traditional knowledge. They know how their region behaves, how the rivers behave, and they have historic knowledge. So if they are participant of the developmental process, if they are consulted in the projects, then that creates a hedge against such hazards. Then we must look at climate resilient infrastructures. We must look at more sustainable planning of infrastructure. Then we must go for disaster preparedness, and this happens at a local level. And we are talking about the PRIs, the Panchayati Raj institutions. Now we must remember that Himachal itself is mostly rural in nature. Almost 80% of Himachal Pradesh is rural, and therefore the Panchayati Raj institutions can play a vital role in disaster preparedness. But most importantly, we have to understand that whenever we are looking at any development activities, we must keep in mind the principle of carrying capacity and the idea of precautionary principle. As if we go for further development, further concretization, without looking at the carrying capacity of the region, without looking at precautionary principle, what happens is that the frequency and intensity of such hazards may further increase, given that climate change is a reality today. Right? Now, let's look at the second article. So, the second article is in context of our National Security Advisor meeting the Chinese Foreign Minister. And this comes in the backdrop of the strained relationships between India and China and the standoff which has continued since the times of Galwan and Doklam. Now, China's behavior is under notice, not only in terms of India, but also around the world. Why? Because China has arrived with a $14 trillion economy, and it uses this $14 trillion, this economic prowess, to go for its ambitions in terms of changing the global world order, in terms of reorienting the global world order towards a Chinese-oriented world. Now, this newfound aggressiveness was more so visible post-COVID, when it was bulldozing its way all across its neighborhood. So China shares borders with 14 countries, but it has disputes with 17 countries. That itself tells us that China is going beyond its own territories and it wants territorial expansion. This is also visible in its wolf warrior diplomacy, where it is bulldozing small nations through extremely aggressive diplomatic measures. Then it has been bulldozing Taiwan, it has been bulldozing Hong Kong, bringing them closer, bringing them under the Communist Party reining them in by various laws like national security law, then incursion in airspace. So smaller countries are time and again being challenged. Now, what is the issue with our LAC? So LAC has not been demarcated. Now, one thing is agreed that there will be a final settlement which will be sector wise. So each sector will have its own settlement and nothing will be agreed until everything is settled. That means smaller agreements, let's say if in the middle sector there is some agreement, that will only be valid if all the border issues are solved. But time and again, China would keep on raising newer issues so that the border issue is not settled. Why? Because China wants to completely grow and then show its true powers, true colors. Now, what are the issues between India and China? So one is the border conflict. So we have seen that from Depsang in 2013 to Chumar Valley in 2014, then Doklam in 17, Galwan in 20, and recently Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh in 2022. So there has been border skirmishes, and Galwan was the bloodiest of all, where we lost 20 of our soldiers. So unsettled LAC, then conflicts along LAC. Then looking at Indian Ocean region, when we see Indian Ocean region, we say that China is trying to create listening posts, trying to create ports. And these ports are part of the string of pearls. And it basically wants to encircle India. Why? Because India has the Indian Ocean region. And India also has global ambitions. It also wants to be part of the emerging global order. But China wants to cut India into its size. It wants to limit India's progress. Right? That is why it is always blocking India in terms of India's diplomatic endeavors. Now, string of pearls and then one belt, one road. Now, China has been using these jargons of infrastructure development. These infrastructure development projects in the name of one belt, one road or new Silk Route to trap smaller countries. Now, how it operates? So basically, let's say there is a smaller country and there are two political parties or three political parties. So Chinese functionaries, they will start, including the embassy staff, they will start giving some money to them. So they will pump money to corrupt politicians. Once they get the corrupt politicians, then they will get, let's say, some projects, some big projects. And these projects will be in form of, let's say, airport, or it can be a rail line, or it can be a mineral lease, mining related operation. Then China will say that this airport requires $10 billion and we'll only build the airport, but we can also give you a loan. Now, these corrupt, crooked politicians, they will agree to such a deal because they are in cahoots. So then China will lend $10 billion. Now, given that all the politicians in this small country, they are corrupt. So what will happen to the economics of this country? It will be poor naturally, the revenues will be poor. So how will this small country repay a $10 billion loan? So it will not be able to repay. Once it is not able to repay this, what will happen? This will be turned into a lease agreement. Where the airport will be leased to some Chinese company for 99 years. Now, that is essentially the checkbook diplomacy or the debt trap diplomacy of China. And where does the money come from? So, China has done something which is called trade distortion. So, with trade distortion, China has built around $3 to $4 trillion of reserves. And it employs these reserves with the Central Bank of China. So these reserves are then employed to get smaller countries to sign very big loan agreements which they cannot fulfill, and finally leading to, let's say, taking over of strategic assets. So that is debt trap and checkbook diplomacy, cutting big checks to smaller countries. And trade distortion is the favorite tool of China. So dumping of goods, whether it is steel, whether it is plastics, whether it is electronics. So China has been dumping goods not only in India but across the world. It is devaluing yuan, and that is the prime accusation of US in terms of US-China trade dispute. And then it has been continuously benefiting with internationalization of yuan. Given that we have the Russia-Ukraine crisis, in this crisis, yuan has emerged as an internationalized currency. So more and more, we see that China's influence not only in the neighborhood but in the world is increasing. When we look at our neighborhood, what it has done with Nepal, it has completely taken over the economy by dumping of goods, by buying politicians, by getting favorable policy, by instigating Nepal against India. Then the dictatorship in Myanmar, the military junta is directly being supported by China. Then when we look at the crisis, the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, again part of the debt trap diplomacy. Then when we are looking at China-Pakistan economic corridor, when we are looking at building of ports, it is again part of string of pearls, encirclement of India. Then we are looking at creation of ports and military bases. A very good example is Djibouti, where China has invested $1 billion and it has also taken over the Hanban Tota port of Sri Lanka. It has also taken over the Gwadar port of Pakistan. Now, what is the Indian response? So, India has to take a lot of tactical measures as well as strategic measures. Now, one is that we have to counter it with, the string of pearls has to be countered with necklace of diamonds. Now, Chabahar Port, Sabang Port, Sitwe Port, Mongla Port, Changi Naval Base. This is where India is looking at. So, India also wants to get more influence in the Indian Ocean region. Then, countering China through Quad and maybe a future expansion of Quad Plus. So, India is looking to align more towards the West. And that will be visible if we look closely at the recent visits of Prime Minister Modi to US and France, where the fulcrum is about technology transfer and advanced weapons. Whether we are looking at drones, whether we are looking at submarines, this is to strengthen India, right? Then India believes in Sagar, security and growth for all. Then countering the Silk route with our spice route. Then we are also looking at developing Andaman and Nicobar, because this gives us the potential to choke the Malacca Strait. Why Malacca is extremely important for China? Because China is dependent upon world trade. So the $3 to $4 trillion that we're talking about has come from trade only. So Malacca becomes extremely important for China. Then we must also look at technology when we are talking about R&D, when we are talking about technology transfers, when we are talking about government to government agreement. So we must look at both emerging technologies in the field of AI, ML, and also technologies which are dual use or military in use or space technology. So we must go for government to government collaboration with similar countries, like-minded countries, democracies, right, to say so. Then we must also go for a blue water navy. While we are kept busy, while China wants us to be busy in our northern frontiers, we should not ignore the Indian Ocean region, and therefore we need a blue water navy. Then we must be first responders in the Indian Ocean region to the smaller littoral countries for anything that they need. Whether it is disaster management, whether it is failure of, let's say, a desalination plant, whether it is crisis of drinking water, right? Then we have to go for full spectrum military preparedness. We cannot ignore the Chinese threat. Today it is just a threat. It might boil down into a bigger conflict. So we can never ignore the preparedness aspect. Then diplomatic engagement, which can entail regular summit-oriented visits. Then uninterrupted border negotiations, confidence-building measures, and we must also look at free and fair trade, not just trade, but free and fair trade without the trade distortions. Then we have to get our friendly neighborhood back. We have to rein in all the countries which are trapped in the dead tab diplomacy or the checkbook diplomacy of China. Right? Now we look at the third article. So this pertains to the internet shutdown in Manipur. Now it has been lifted after 83 days, and similar precedent was seen in JNK when Article 370 was abrogated. Now the matter went to High Court and Supreme Court, but they refused to intervene. The High Court was listening to the issue. Now, what do I mean by internet shutdown? So it can be about disruption of internet services in a particular area, let's say blocking of a specific website, or it can be the complete internet itself. It can mean slowing down, or it can be removal of entire internet access. It can also mean the full spectrum, or it can be partially imposed. Let's say I am allowing broadband, but I am cancelling all the services, the mobile phones, right? So it totally depends upon case to case basis upon the situation. Now, why are internet shutdowns imposed? So basically to contain law and order, so that there is no more riots, so that social media is not used to create rumors, to create hate speeches, and to ensure that there is more peace and tranquility in the state. Now, what are the impacts? So legal implications can be that the internet ban can very well violate someone's right. Let's say right to movement, right to do business, right to profession. So all those rights can be affected. Then economic impact. Naturally, any business which is dependent upon internet or which is fed by internet itself, let's say cyber cafe. What will happen to a cyber cafe? Right? What will happen to, let's say, someone who is booking online tickets, e-tickets? Then social impact. So when we are not talking to our near and dear ones, when we are disconnected, what happens? When we are connected, what happens? Diffusion. We are more connected. Time and space is compressed. What happens when this compression doesn't happen? We become distant. So there is naturally a social impact. We become distant from our family itself. And so the social impact can very well lead to psychological impacts also, right? So long-term psychological impacts. Then what will happen to students, to school students who, let's say, are watching online lectures, someone who is taking up a coaching. So what will happen to them? Then political impact. What happens is whenever state power is used, whenever state is using any power, there are chances that there are misuses, naturally. And so what happens is that during times of conflict, during times of turmoil, what happens is that political opponents, that press or the citizenry, the active citizenry in general, they are usually the victims of some stringent laws. So how will they report that, let's say, there is some abuse of power? So what will happen to the media person? What will happen to right to press? Let's say I want to write an article because I was kicked by a policeman, right? So can I write it during an internet shutdown? No. Even if I write it, can I publish it? No. I cannot publish it digitally. I can only publish it in newspaper, right? Now, legality. So when we are looking at internet shutdowns, so prior to 2017, section 144 of CRPC was being used. But post 2017, rules were brought under the Telegraph Act. These are called the Temporary Suspension of Telecom Services Rules 2017. Here, what happens is that a shutdown can be up to 15 days only in one time, and then it has to be approved by Secretary of the Ministry of Home Affairs, that is the Central Ministry of Home Affairs Secretary, or the Secretary of the Home Department in the state government, right? So some checks and balance were introduced post 2017, that not every magistrate can just go for, just impose 144 and shut down the internet. Because if that happens, then shutdown of internet itself becomes the way forward to control any public disorder, right? Now, what happened is that issues came before the court. One issue came in Kerala High Court, that is Fahima Shireen versus State of Kerala. Here, a student was denied internet. There was some moral policing done in a hostel regarding the time that a person can access internet. So the Kerala High Court held that right to access of internet, mind the words, right to access to internet is a fundamental right. And this is a High Court speaking, right? That means it will only be valid in Kerala unless it is challenged. And it was challenged again. And it will be valid throughout the territory of India if this ratio comes from the Supreme Court. However, this was not coming from Supreme Court. This is a Kerala High Court judgment. So in Fahima Shireen, what happens is that a student is denied internet and the court holds that the right to access to internet itself is a fundamental right. And it is part of right to life and liberty. And it is also part of right to privacy and is also part of right to education. Therefore, it is a fundamental right to access itself. Now, that simply means that if this were the ratio, then every citizen of India should have internet, should have access to internet. That means nobody can be denied internet, right? But this has been challenged. So we can refer to this as an example, as a progressive example, but this is not the law of the land as of now. Now, another important case regarding this is Anuradha Bhasin versus Union of India. Now, Anuradha Bhasin is a journalist. So she went before the court, before the Supreme Court, and asked for violation of Article 19(1)(a) and 19(1)(g). So A, why? Because A includes a gamut of rights. 19(1)(a) is your freedom of speech and expression. And within freedom of speech and expression comes your right of free speech under right to press, right? Then of occupation, right to practice your own occupation under 19(1)(g). So Anuradha Bhasin contended that 19(1)(a) and 19(1)(g) has been violated. Now, what the court said is the court did not dwell itself. The court did not go into whether the right to access to internet is a fundamental right or not. It did not go into it. It went into whether the internet shutdown in Kashmir Valley was justified or not. And what are the guidelines? What are the moot points that has to be considered when we are looking at internet shutdown? So it said that 19(1)(a) comes naturally. It has to be read together with 19(2). 19(2) is what? Reasonable restrictions. So any right is not absolute, and there are reasonable restrictions, right? But how reasonable, that has to be seen with the test of proportionality. The test of proportionality. And this test of proportionality was given in J. Puttaswamy. In J. Puttaswamy. Basically, your right to privacy judgment. Now, so the test of proportionality says is to determine whether a government action is justified infringement on an individual's fundamental right or not. Now, what is doctrine of proportions? So, when I say that you are doing something wrong, so there is a punishment. So let's say you are doing this much wrong and this is the punishment. These are proportional. But let's say you are doing this much wrong and your punishment is extreme. Then this is not proportional. That means the object that the state wants to achieve through a law, it has to prove that the punishment therefore given or the limitations, the reasonable restrictions that the state is imposing, that is commensurate or that is proportional to the crime committed or to the problem or to the object that the state wants to achieve. Then, about reasonable restriction, government can impose restriction as long as they are sanctioned by law, reasonable in nature and for legitimate purposes, limited to interest of sovereignty, integrity, security, etc. Then complete restriction, like what happened in Article 370 during abrogation of Article 370, will be determined by court in every case according to the circumstances. That means restriction can also be absolute, but the court will see it in light of judicial review on a case-to-case basis. Now, there are some directions that the court give which are very important. Okay, this is part of your ratio. So, an order suspending internet cannot be indefinite. That is not allowed. Then, it can only be for a temporary duration and every time you have to get a permission. Furthermore, it must adhere to principle of proportionality. This is part of your J. Puttaswamy judgment. And any order suspending internet is subject to judicial review. That means such orders cannot be beyond the purview of the courts. Now, what can be a conclusion in such a question? Now, whenever we are talking about rights, so rights come with what? They come with duties also. And rights are not absolute. They are never absolute. So, there are reasonable restrictions, right, in our constitutional framework. Furthermore, when we look at the state under Article 12. Article 12. So, whenever we are looking at state also has limitations of rule of law. It cannot come with laws on its whims and fancies. It must be lawful. So, a law must also be lawful. And it must abide by the principles of rule of law and it is subject to judicial review. Naturally. Because that comes from the doctrine of checks and balance. Furthermore, the state must look at the test of proportionality before going for internet shutdowns as it can infringe upon the rights vested under Part 3. So, we can say that state must use such extreme powers very sparingly. Why? Because such use of such hard powers can affect the fundamental rights, and it says, Article 13 says that any law which abridges the fundamental right can be called as void, right? Now, two small discussions. One is regarding the instant settlement. So, what used to happen is that, let's say today I buy a share. Let's say today is X. So, I will get that share in my dematerialized demat account in X plus 2. Now, over the period of time, what happened? X plus 2 means 2 days later. So, the actual transaction, every settlement, the final settlement, that means buying, selling, the transfer of money, etc., will be settled in X plus 2. Or we can say, if I am doing something on T, then it was happening at T plus 2. Then gradually we moved from T plus 1, from T plus 2 to from T plus 2 to T plus 1. Now, we are now moving to T. That means that is a very big transformational move. Why? Because let's say today let's say I have 1,000 shares of ITC, right? And my mother is not well and I have to take her to hospital. Now, I have today the option of selling the share and getting my money instantly. Do you understand the gravity? Right? Earlier, I would get this money 2 days or in 24 hours. Right? 2 days when it was T plus 2 and 24 hours when it was T plus 1. So, what it does is, it decreases the lag, right? So, we'll be able to settle the accounts very quickly. We'll be able to withdraw our money very quickly. And this not only helps the big investors, but it also helps the smaller investors. And it will also help bringing more people towards the financial markets, towards, let's say, towards more towards investments, and bringing more people closer to understanding shares and how they are brought and sold. Why? Because there was a confusion, a natural confusion that used to go on. So today, let's say I settled my accounts, I bought some shares, but these shares will not reflect in my demat account until 2 days. So after 2 days, I have to check. Now, what will happen? Today I bought a share, it will be reflected in my demat account. Then if I want to sell it tomorrow, and let's say I have booked a profit, so I'll get the profit as well as my capital back because I need it for some emergency, right? So that is T plus 1 to T plus 0 for you. Then the opposition is planning a no confidence motion. Now, what is a no confidence motion? So the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, they can remain, let's say this is the Prime Minister and this is the Council of Ministers. They can only remain in power with the will of the Lok Sabha, right? If they do not have the majority in the Lok Sabha, then what happens? Then they will sink together. They will have to resign. So, what is a no confidence motion? It is a parliamentary process that allows the opposition to challenge the veracity, the majority of the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, whether or not they hold the majority today. And if this motion is passed in the parliament, they have to resign. Okay, it's a defeat. Then who can move a no confidence motion? So anyone, any member of Lok Sabha can move, but the motion must be supported by 50 members. Then how it is moved, it must be given in writing and signed by the members who are moving it. Furthermore, it is to be submitted to the Speaker of the House. Then the Speaker of the Lok Sabha will decide whether or not to admit it. Once it is decided, there is debate, there is discussion, and then there is voting. And if there is, in this voting, if the government loses, then they will have to resign. The treasury benches, if they lose, then the Prime Minister or on the Council of Ministers will have to resign. That's it from my side. I hope it helped. Thank you so much.